Democrats Abroad. And my name is Patrick Oden. I'm with Lakeside Tax Service. Uno más. Próximo, por favor.
Patrick, sorry, what's
Okay, so I'm going to get to that. I will get to that a little bit later. So who we operate Lakeside Tax Service. We have Ray Hickey, who is an enrolled agent, Carla Diedoff, and myself, Patrick Oden, a CAA, and I'll explain that a little bit later. We're located in San Antonio, Tolayacapan, and for those of you who don't live near, we're very near to Ajijic. We've been in business for over 12 years, and we have 75 years of experience. So today, I want to talk about how to protect yourself from fraud. I want you to realize and know your tax obligations when living abroad, who to contact for help. And please remember that, as accountants, we can only help you before the fact. We can't help you after the fact. So if you have, doubts, always seek help before you make decisions. Okay, so first we're going to go into fraud because it's really a problem these days. It comes in by phone, by email, by WhatsApp, every possible way that you can imagine we get fraud. So a couple of things to go over is that the IRS will always initiate contact with you by letter. That is the only way that the IRS will initiate contact with you. They will never email you for any reason. They will never email you. Now, if for some reason you are already speaking with a person at the IRS and they have initiated that contact by letter, then yes, they may email you, but they will not, it would be just a notification. It would not have any personal information, nor would it have asked for payment. The IRS will never, back one. The IRS will never call you on the phone just out of the blue. They will never send you a text message, not ever. And they will never demand immediate payment under any circumstances. Any demand for payment would be made through a letter. In fact, I just went through an audit with a client and they required me to fax all the papers to them. They would not even, the auditor, even though I had identified myself, would not accept anything from me via email. She wanted it mailed or faxed. And since I was here in Mexico, to avoid the DHL charges, we faxed everything in. Okay, next. So one of the things that you can do to protect yourself from fraud is to maintain stable contact information. As if you've noticed lately, the new way to combat fraud is the two-step identification, meaning that not only do you need to know your password, but you need to receive either an email or a text message so that there are two ways that they're identifying that it's you. Someone may steal your password, but they're not going to steal your telephone at the same time. At least it's highly unlikely. But in order to do that, you need to maintain stable contact information in the form of your telephone number and your email. So one thing that a lot of people here in Mexico, we have many people, instead of having a plan like you may in the US, we have prepaid numbers that we pick up on the street and we use that. The problem is, if you have that number linked to certain accounts and you lose your telephone or your SIM card goes bad, if you don't have that number registered, you have no way to get that number back. So I suggest that if you do pick up a prepaid card from Movistar, from Telcel, from AT&T, all you need to do is to go into the office of one of these companies. If you're here in Ajijic, there's a Telcel right up in Laguna Mall. If you have a Telcel prepaid telephone, you can walk in, tell them your telephone number, give them your identification, and they will register that telephone number under your name. So in the future, if you lose your phone, if your phone is stolen, or if the chip goes bad, all you have to do is go back into the Telcel office with your identification. They'll give you a new chip, with the same exact telephone number. Cost you about 100 pesos. Almost every email provider has secondary contact information. And the way that they have this information so that you have a way to reset account access in case it's lost. You forget the password, someone steals your password and changes it. That's a real possibility. If anyone steals your password to your email account, the first thing they will do is change the password so that you can't get back in. So the way that you work around that is you make sure that you have a secondary email address on the account and that you have a telephone number listed on the account as backup so that you can reestablish your password.
Excuse me,
Don't
Patrick,
ever
the screen
underestimate.
sharing stopped. Patrick, the screen sharing is not visible to us.
No, one moment.
Right, I just typed that.
While he's working on that, let me go ahead and talk about the last point that was on one of the slides that you may or may not have seen if you're on the mobile, is that don't ever underestimate the power of a strong password. I can't tell you how many times people give me a password or try to give me a password, and it's something so simple that anyone could guess it. So your password should always have a minimum of 12 characters. They should have upper, lower case, and a special character. And people say, yeah, but I can't remember that. So just think of things that you can remember. Someone's telephone number, someone's name, and then combine all of that to make your password as long as you can, and you can still remember it. Could be your best friend's phone number and their name, or a city name, whatever you can think about to make it long, but not make it so complicated that you can't remember it.
Password software, you recommend one?
Could I interject? Well, I'm going to then.
I
There
can't
are
really speak to
password
it. I mean,
keeper
there
apps.
have been problems with some of the password software, but I think it's not a bad option. I mean, it's not perfect, but there are protections built into the different password savers. It's better than just saving it on your browser. No, the different ones.
So Lisa, did you want to interject?
No. Okay, for those who are on the Zoom call, unfortunately, we cannot get the presentation to you. If you want a copy of the presentation, we can send that to you later. Okay, so I'm going to continue so that we can finish up on time.
As a Zoom member, are you saying that we'll get a recording that we can then watch later and it will have the
Yes,
presentation?
this is being recorded, so you should be able to see this later and see all of the slides.
Okay.
So people always ask me, what address should I use? You know, I'm living in Mexico. Should I give them a Mexican address? Should I give them my address in Texas? Should I give them where I last lived? Trust me, the address that is on your 1040 should be where you can receive a letter or for notification from the IRS. The IRS really does not care where you live. In those rare things that happen and they do want to know where you live, they will ask for it. For example, if you operate a business, if you have a Schedule C, they're going to ask you for the address of the business. That business may be in Mexico, it may be in the US, but that can be different or the same as your address that's on your 1040. So if the IRS wants to know where you live, they're going to ask for it on the form. Otherwise, the address that you should have on the front of your tax return should always be where you can receive a letter. Also to keep in mind that certain states, when you have an address in a state that has a tax, these states will buy a list from the federal government with the AGI, the Social Security number. By AGI, I mean adjusted gross income. They want to know, is it worth our time to go after you so you can pay state taxes or not? But if you have a higher income, a higher AGI, and you have a zip code in their state, their computers will filter through and they'll say, oh, this person didn't file a tax return in the state. Now, you may not be living in the state. So in this case, and we'll talk about this later, you would want to file a non-resident tax return for that state, especially certain states such as New York, California, Illinois. Those are the states that are most proactive in looking for people that may not have filed a tax return. Also, I always encourage people, if you're going to have your mail delivered to the house of a family member, if your last name is not the same, always use an in care of. And the reason is that sometimes, especially the postal carriers, see that it's a letter or a check from the IRS. They go, this is really important, but I don't recognize this person here at this address. They'll send it back to the IRS. And then the IRS has returned mail. They think they don't have a good address on file for you. So I encourage everyone to use in care of names. Whoever lives at that address, sorry. So the in care of would be the person living at that address. Okay. So one thing, and this goes back to what address should we have on our 1040? The IRS has an identity verification program. What they're trying to do is they're trying to reduce fraud in the tax system. It requires the ability to receive a letter with a control number. So the first part of this is you file a tax return, it gets sent to identity verification program, they put it on hold, and they send you a letter. Your tax return will not be processed until you pass the identity verification program. So you can see that if you can't receive the letter, then you can't get through the identity verification program. They will not allow you to change your address while you're in identity verification, because obviously they're checking to see if this is a fraudulent return. They want to know that you can get a letter at the address that was listed on your tax return. And so it creates a vicious cycle for those people who don't have an address that's valid, don't have an address where they can get the mail, or have a Mexican address where it takes 2 or 3 months for you to get the letter.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
That wouldn't apply if you use TurboTax or something, right?
Could apply to anyone.
Yeah, but there's no mail involved.
No, what happens is
If you do, I mean,
it happens anytime you file a tax return, no matter how you file. It could be electronic, it could be on paper. You could be sent to identity verification for any year. And I can't tell you that it makes any sense to why they choose certain people. It does seem to happen more
it's not everybody.
It seems to happen more when something has changed on your return, such as an address or your income, things like that. If you ever do get this letter, you're going to need to call the IRS to get through this process. It's rather simple. You let the person at the IRS guide you as to what is the information that they want. There is a number, 800 number that comes on the letter. And instead of using that number, if you can't call those from Mexico, you can call 267-941-1083. That's just a regular US number, but it goes to that same department. Let's see, Proxima.
Patrick, could you please repeat questions from the audience, because on Zoom we can't hear the questions?
Yes, we're going to take questions at the end, and so sorry for the interruption there. So on the slideshow, when you get a copy of the slideshow, you're going to see on one of the slides the web address to create an online account. If you see ID Me is actually a private business. They're working with the IRS to help people set up online accounts and to make sure that these are set up in a secure manner. You can set up an account with the IRS and you do not need a US cell phone. A lot of people say, oh, I need one of those. That's an option and it helps them to verify your identity, but having a US cell phone is not a requirement. What you may need is a computer that has a camera and a microphone, or you can do it on your telephone. I will tell you, as tax preparers, we had to go and set up an ID.me account. The identification process that we used before was no longer going to work. Since I don't have a US cell phone, then a live person came on. I had already uploaded my passport. I had already uploaded a secondary identification. A person came on the camera and asked me to please hold up my passport beside my face so that she could verify that that was me, that I had my passport in hand. It took about 5 to 7 minutes. And when we were finished, I had my access restored. And also setting up an account with the IRS is a way to combat fraud, because you can go in and you can check and see if your tax return was filed. You can see if they've sent you a letter. You can see if there's any balance due. So this is a way for you to independently verify something that you may have received from the IRS. Next. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about state returns. When you're moving to Mexico and you've been in a state that has a state income tax, what you want to do if you're moving down in the middle of the year is to make sure that you file as part resident for a resident for part of the year. We call it a partial year return. So you are a resident for part of the year and you're a non-resident for part of the year. What this will notify the state taxing authorities, it notifies them that you're then moving out of the state so that they don't look for a tax return from you in the future. Afterwards, generally no state tax return is required. This is something that a lot of preparers in the US, they don't know the concept of simply not having a state. But you no longer live in any state, so there's no reason for you to pay any state tax at all. The exception to that would be if you have rentals in the state, because then that income is derived from property that's located in the state. And certain partnerships, if you're a member of a partnership, then that partnership may own property in the state. And that may require you to file a non-resident return to pay income tax on that specific income in the state. If you renew your driver's license in certain states, they will come back and say, oh, you filed a non-resident return, but you have a driver's license. It normally does not cause a problem when you've moved out of the state. But if you go back and renew your license in the state and their Department of Motor Vehicles speaks with their revenue department, they could actually come back and say, they could deny your non-resident return, saying that you are a resident because you have a driver's license. We don't see that in all states. We see that in a couple of states. Some of the northern states, Minnesota, Michigan, they actually look to see if you have a hunting or fishing license to determine if you're a resident. And then in all cases, if for any reason you're back in a state for 183 days or more during a calendar year, you're considered a tax resident of that state. One thing very important to know is that your voting address alone does not constitute residency. So you vote with the last address that you had in the US until you establish a new address in the US. So we're going to talk just a moment about Mexican taxes. And in Mexico, the IRS is known as SAT, el Servicio de Administración Tributaria. If you've ever been to SAT, it's one of the few government agencies that really works on schedule. So if your appointment is at 11:03 and you arrive at 11:04, they will tell you, sorry, you were late for your appointment. You'll have to reschedule that. It's amazing. Mexico has generally been very lenient with their foreign residents. And most people who are from the US do not need to file a tax return in Mexico. The exception to that would be if you have substantial investment income from Mexican sources, such as bank accounts. And by substantial, I'm talking about investments of above $200,000. Even if you have that, You may not need to file a tax return, but it may be beneficial if you do. Also, if you have a rental property here in Mexico, that would be subject to Mexican tax. And don't let anyone tell you that, it is true that Mexico taxes their residents on their worldwide income. That is a true statement. But many people try to scare retirees with that information. The truth is, and sorry more for the misspelling here, the tax treaty protects your Social Security and it protects pensions from being taxed in Mexico. It does not mention an IRA, but since the only way that you can contribute to an IRA is through work or wages, self-employment, then it's understood that distributions from an IRA are also not taxable in Mexico because that income is based on work that was performed in the US. One thing, it's bad enough when you ask your US tax preparer to help you avoid taxes. We don't like that, but people do it. Don't ask your Mexican accountant to help you avoid taxes. They're really under the gun when it comes to their performance. And so you don't want to put them in a position where they could lose their license. Próxima. Another word about foreign rentals. When you have a rental in Mexico, so the income and the expenses, or the rental income and the expenses, should be declared in the US because you're a US citizen and taxed on your worldwide income. Should also be declared in Mexico. One nice little thing about Mexico, not the US, is that they have kind of a standard deduction so that instead of putting all of your expenses, you just take 30% of your rent off, declare your property taxes, and pay income tax on the remainder. As far as the US, you still need to report all of your expenses. One difference under the, when you have a foreign rental property, if it's a residential property, instead of depreciating over 27.5 years, you depreciate that over 30 years. And anything that has to go on a depreciation table will have a slightly longer depreciation period when it's a foreign property. Whenever a person uses their rental property during a year for more than 14 days of personal use, vacation time, you cannot deduct 100% of your expenses. So as long as your personal use time is 14 days or less, you can deduct 100% of the expenses related to the rental. If it's more than 14 days, then it has to be proportioned between personal use time and rental time. If you're staying in your property and the purpose of that time in your property is to care for it, you're painting, you're seeing plumbers, and we know here in Mexico, you may be waiting weeks sometimes for the person to show up, but you would not count those days as personal use if your primary reason for staying in your property was to care for it. You may have heard of a 1031 exchange. A 1031 exchange allows you to sell one income producing property, such as a rental, and buy another. And it allows you to not avoid, but to delay the tax on that. In the case of a 1031 exchange, you cannot do 1031 from the US to a foreign country, nor from a foreign country to the US. But if you had a property in, say, Costa Rica, and you wanted to sell that and buy a property in Mexico, you could do a 1031 exchange to avoid realizing the income and avoid paying immediate tax on that transaction.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that. You're saying you could do 1031 exchange with other countries, but not between the US and
Yeah, so there was a question from the audience that came up about 1031 exchanges. And yes, that's correct. You can do a 1031 exchange between two US properties, and you can do a 1031 exchange between two foreign properties, no matter which country they're in. But you can't do a 1031 between a US property and a foreign property. So one responsibility that a lot of people have once they move to Mexico is the Fine Sin 114. That's formerly known as the F bar, and most of us still call it the F bar. Anytime you have a foreign account, no matter the balance, you're required to check yes on Schedule B. However, if your account is below $10,000 and you're not required to file a tax return, there's no obligation for you to file a tax return just to check that box. This is where a lot of people really get tied up in their thinking. So I'll read it. If the aggregate value of all non-US bank accounts exceed $10,000 equivalent at any time during the year, the FineSend 114 is required. I've had people come into the office and they said, oh no, my Mexican bank accounts were low. But then when I prodded a little bit more, well, they had bank accounts in Europe or they had bank accounts in Australia. So it all goes together. We have to look at what is the balance of all of your foreign bank accounts. This report is due on April the 15th. If you don't file it on April 15th, there is an automatic extension until October 15th. Fortunately, this is one thing that they've made a little bit easier for us. So we really have until October 15th, and there's no extension form that you need to file. This report also applies when you are a fiduciary on an account, such as a charity, a club, a church, or temple. So if you're in an organization and you see that you have other US citizens as signers on the bank account, the proper thing to do would be to make sure that every US citizen reports this account under their own social security number, so that the club, charity, church is protected from any action by the IRS. And just so you know, when you do report one of these accounts, it does get reported as a fiduciary account. So it gets reported as an account where it is not your money, but you are a signer on the account. Many people say, well, I'm a beneficiary, or I don't know if I should report the account because I'm not sure of my status. If you can go into the bank and withdraw money from the account, then it's an account that you should be reporting. Okay. Another type of form that many people who are living abroad will need to file at some point in their life is a foreign asset report. This form is Form 8938. It's part of your tax return. And for this form, the limits are different. So if you're single with assets of $200,000 on the last day of the year, or more than $300,000 at any time during the year, you need to file an 8938. If you're married filing jointly, then those limits are double that. But the difference is, whereas the FineSend 114 only includes bank accounts and brokerage accounts, this also includes the value of life insurance if you have a foreign life insurance policy. This form is due with the tax return. So it's due April 15th. For people who live abroad, it would be due on June 15th, or if you file an extension, on October 15th. Think about it as a map. What the IRS is wanting to know on this form is how much foreign interest you're reporting and where you're reporting it on your tax return. So it helps them to look and make sure that you're reporting your foreign income.
Is that asset interest or principal, or does how?
So the question is, how do we determine the limits as to if you're required to file this or not? So the limits would be based on your bank accounts, your brokerage accounts, and the value of life insurance.
Not real problem.
That's a good question. So the question was, does this include real property such as homes and rental? No, it does not include homes nor rental property, nor cars. Próximo.
I'm a trustee of the trust, but how do I do that?
Okay, so I'm going to put that question till last, and we'll come back to that. So a lot of people ask, can I deduct my charity here in Mexico, my charitable contributions? And the answer to that is it's more difficult. First of all, you must have foreign income, and that can be from wages if you're working here in Mexico like I am. It could be also from interest, or it could be from a rental property in Mexico. But the source of your income must be foreign income. You also, if you have a brokerage account in the US, you may have foreign income in that brokerage account if you hold certain foreign stocks. That would also be foreign income for determining if you could deduct your charitable contributions in Mexico. In Mexico, a charitable organization is normally an AC. It's Asociación Civil. And so if you want to know if it's an official charity, you ask if it's an AC. Like I said, the deduction cannot include, the deduction that you put on your tax return for foreign charitable contributions cannot exceed your foreign income. If you don't have foreign income and you want to give to charities in Mexico, consider organizations that have a US charity attached. There are a number of charities in this area, and I'm sure there are other charities throughout Mexico that have a US 503C, so that you can give the money in the US to their account, take the tax deduction, but the funds will be used here in Mexico. Unfortunately, with the tax law changes and the higher standard deduction, most charitable contributions really don't help people on their taxes anymore. Unless you, and what happens is all of the charitable contributions and other itemized things get lumped together. So once people move to Mexico, they don't have lower property taxes. They have generally fewer deductions. They take the standard deduction instead of itemizing. And so therefore, the charitable deductions are usually of little value. Sorry about that. What I suggest is if you're taking money from an IRA, that you consider using a QCD, which is qualified charitable distribution. So let's say you're going to have a $25,000 withdrawal from your IRA this year. You want to donate to a charity. It would have to be a US charity, although it could be a charity that has connections to Mexico. Instead of paying tax on that $25,000 withdrawal, you would contact your brokerage company. You would tell them to which charity you want to give the money. And let's say that you were, able to give $5,000 of your $25,000 withdrawal. The brokerage firm would send a check for $5,000 straight to the charity. You would never see that in your bank account. Your 1099 that you received from the brokerage would say 25,000 withdrawal, 25,000 taxable. So your contribution would not be reflected on your 1099. However, when we file your tax return, we would then add the qualified charitable distribution. The taxable amount would then be 20,000 rather than 25. So you essentially would be giving this money directly before you get it and never paying tax on this money. So if you're fortunate to have the funds where you don't need them, but you have to make a required minimum distribution, you can always consider using the QCD. You can actually give up to $100,000 a year through the QCD. Next, please. So let's talk about a little bit about investments in Mexico. And before, I think I kind of tiptoed around about this, but now I've been with a couple of people to banks. I see what people get themselves into. And so I will be right up front. Don't purchase foreign mutual funds. They most likely run afoul of the private foreign investment corporation rules. You are not able to report correctly the income that you're getting from that mutual fund, and it puts you in the place where you're not accurately reporting your income. So since you can't do this, the thing that you should buy is fixed income investments. So this would be savings accounts where they pay interest here in Mexico, certificates of deposit, or CETES. It's CETES, and those are Mexican government bonds. If you want to know how safe are Mexican government bonds, and you pay attention to the ratings agencies, S&P rates Mexico debt as a triple B, not a triple B minus. That is just a hyphen there. They rate it as a triple B, which is considered investment grade. It's lower investment grade, but it's considered investment grade. And as they would say, it's adequate capacity to meet financial commitments, but more subject to adverse economic conditions. One thing that you should do, though, is you should include your investments in Mexico in your overall picture. So I hear that people come to me and they say, oh, you know, my financial advisor, she's after me now because I have all my money in stock. And the financial advisor is not aware of the investments in Mexico. So if you have a financial advisor who is advising you and making sure that you're not stock heavy or you're not fixed investment heavy, you need to let him or her know of your investments here in Mexico so they can include those in the overall mix of your portfolio. People ask a lot, well, would you invest a lot of money in Mexico? So one of the problems with investing here is your currency fluctuation risk. And my question to them is, where will you spend the money? Because if you're bringing money down and investing it, that you eventually will spend here, you're not really going to suffer that much from the currency risk. If these are funds that you may need to send back to the US someday, that's when you're going to be really affected by the currency risk or the change in currency. Please remember to add beneficiaries to your bank accounts. Just as in the US, you can add beneficiaries to your bank accounts here. Mexican probate takes far longer than the US system. However, in my experience, people who have beneficiaries have few problems. The beneficiaries have few problems getting the funds from the bank as long as they can produce identification and a death certificate. And I have witnessed that myself because a couple of clients who unfortunately have died have left beneficiaries. And I was responsible for contacting the beneficiaries and making sure that they had gotten the funds. And in all cases, I can report that they were able to get the funds. But consider that your beneficiary may need to either get an attorney here who would have power of attorney, or may need to physically travel to Mexico in order to get the funds from your bank. So if you're in your 60s and you're leaving it to your 80-year-old sister who's never traveled outside the country, think about what are the possibilities that she would want to come down to Mexico to get the money. Just something to think about. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about love and money, because people say, oh no, this is not going to happen to me, but one never knows. So when you are married to a non-citizen of the US, you as a citizen have the right to treat that person as if he or she were a resident or citizen of the US for tax purposes. This does not affect immigration at all, neither negatively or positively. It's simply a fact that you can treat your spouse as if he or she were a citizen. So if it's a Mexican spouse that has a lower income than perhaps you do, you're looking at having a substantial savings, because now your standard deduction is going to be double what it was as a single person or as a married filing separate. In order to declare your tax return jointly with this person, they must have an ITIN number. An ITIN number is an identification number similar to a social security number, begins with a 9, and is for people who are not eligible for social security numbers. It allows the IRS to identify this person. In order to get a W-7, you normally have to submit your married filing jointly tax return with a W-7, which is the form requesting the tax identification number, and you have to send in original identification. Now, you can imagine if it takes 4 to 6 months for that to be issued from the IRS, you're waiting that time, and meanwhile, your spouse's passport is at the IRS. He or she does not have use of the passport, and then you're going to have to pray that they actually send the passport back. In my experience, they send about 80% of those documents back. And I don't fault Mexican mail. We have an address in the US. I know that they were not sending those documents back to us. So in order for you to get to send copies, you have to go to a certifying acceptance agent. That's a CAA. That's what I am. I'm one of 6 people in Mexico that can certify those documents, so that then you just send a copy of the passport or other documentation along with your W-7 and your tax return. Once this number is issued, then, and in the year that you request a W-7 for a spouse, in the year that you request an I-10 for a spouse, that tax return has to be filed on paper. After the I-10 is issued, then you can file your tax return electronically, just as if both people had a social security number. If the immigration status of your spouse changes, if he or she then becomes a resident of the US or a citizen of the US later, the social security number would replace the I-10. In case you pass away, if you are filing jointly with your spouse, even though the spouse is not a US citizen, he or she does have the power to present your last tax return. I know everyone is worried about this. You know, it's like, okay, I'm dead and I have to do another tax return. Yes. Generally speaking, you need that one last tax return. But the spouse can also present as a resident for 2 more years. So if he or she is receiving Social Security, that might be a benefit. If they're receiving benefits based on your Social Security, once you pass away, then that would save them a 30% tax. And just to mention, if you have a Mexican spouse and you've never made the spouse a resident of the US, if you pass away, that spouse has 2 years in order to request residency based on their marriage to you. So unfortunately, there's a thing called a federal transfer certificate. You may have never heard of this, and unfortunately, when people do hear about it, it's at the worst time of their life because their spouse has passed away. They have contacted the brokerage firm or they've contacted the bank, and the bank has told them, well, sorry, we need a federal transfer certificate and your funds are frozen. This applies to all US citizens who live abroad. It could apply to anyone who dies in Mexico, even if they don't have residency here. The transfer certificate takes 6 to 9 months to be issued after you apply for it. The application is normally not that difficult. It requires an affidavit. It requires stating that there was no tax due in Mexico, and it requires giving the IRS your account numbers and the balance of the account as of the date of death. But what you should consider when you're living abroad and when you have a spouse is consider your spouse's need for liquid funds until the transfer certificate can be processed. So if your spouse has Social Security, okay, they have an income. But if your spouse is depending on taking money from an account where you're joint tenants in common, you really should make some provision so that each spouse has in an account in their own name and has money to get through a period of 6 to 9 months until they can get the transfer certificate issued from the IRS.
Can I ask a question? Are you
One
okay
second.
with it?
Yeah, 1 second. And finally, it depends on the bank or brokerage firm. I can't really tell you why I mean, I obviously know the reason why they're asking for this, but sometimes people go to get their funds. It's clear the person has died abroad. There's no problem. And then sometimes the spouse is working through this issue to get everything taken care of. And right at the last moment, the compliance department for the brokerage firm comes in and says, yes, we have everything except the transfer certificate, which they didn't mention before, but now they've determined that they need it at the last moment. So it's really, really important that your spouse have funds in a bank account in his or her name, apart from the funds that are joint tenants in common.
So is the issue if one spouse dies, both live in Mexico, both US citizens,
So,
and one spouse dies, and it's a joint account,
so
how likely am I go to jail if I transfer funds into my own personal account from a joint account after she's already dead?
So the question is, if there's a joint tenants in common account, can you transfer those funds after your spouse dies without a problem? I would say yes, if joint tenants in common, you could transfer those funds into your own account. And that may be the wisest thing to do, is to transfer those funds before the brokerage firm finds out that your spouse has died. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about investments. We've been talking about, people who have significant assets, but let's talk about, not everyone who's retired in Mexico has investments. And some people here are just living on Social Security. And what I see or have seen is that a person gets into a situation when they owe the IRS, and now that their income is reduced because they're retired, they no longer have the funds to pay. What do you do? So when you can't pay the IRS, the worst thing you can do is fail to file. You should always file your tax return. If you owe, even if you owe the money, file the tax return. If you need a few days after you file the tax return, you have 60-day grace period where the IRS will not pursue any collection activity after the due date. If you can't pay it within those 60 days, consider making a payment arrangement. A payment arrangement with the IRS can be made online. There's also a form that you can send in to have them to do it. It's a little bit more expensive if you don't do it online, but as long as your payment that you make will cover your debt within 60 months, 5 years, they're pretty much going to accept your offer, whatever it is. They're going to accept that. It's almost an automatic approval if it's less than 60 months. If it goes up to 72, it then requires approval, but still they're likely going to accept your offer. If you can't pay, if you don't have the funds to pay, then what you may want to do is to seek currently not collectible status. For a person who is in or wants to be put in currently non-collectible, we have to send in a statement. And this statement is going to give your income, your assets, and it's going to give your living expenses, such as medical expenses, transportation, rent, all of these things. The IRS looks at that, and then they go, okay, this person has no available funds to pay us. So we're not going to keep hounding them about paying them. They just put you in currently non-collectible status. They send you a one-time-a-year reminder that you owe money to them, but then you're not required to pay it unless your circumstances have changed. You must file a tax return during this time, even if you're not required to file a tax return. If you're in currently not collectible status, you must file a tax return. And after 10 years, the statute of limitations on the amount due would have lapsed, and you would not be required to pay the IRS those funds. The only way to enforce the statute of limitations on the IRS is to file a tax return. So unfortunately, I have some people right now that owe money, have owed the money since about 2009. Had they, during the last 10 years, they had no income. Had they filed a tax return, all would be fine, no problem at all. But they didn't file their tax return. So the statute of limitations has been left open. They still owe this money. And unfortunately, they can't get Social Security because they need a passport to get Social Security in Mexico. And they can't get a passport because they owe more than $50,000 to the IRS. And the IRS is preventing them from getting a passport. So it's a vicious cycle. So always file if you can't pay the IRS, and then we will work around that. Generally, though, for those of you here and on the webcast, generally a denial of passport for unpaid taxes or unfiled taxes is when the IRS knows that you owe more than $50,000 or they think you owe more than $50,000. It is not necessary to file a tax return just to get your passport. If you have no filing obligation, if you have no past due amount, don't let anyone scare you into filing a tax return that you're not required to file. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay, so we're going to try to wrap this up quickly for those of you online, and you'll have to look at this later. Many times when you have a foreign address or when the bank or brokerage firm knows that you live outside the US, they will send you a W-8 BEN and they'll say, hey, fill this out and send it back in. If you are a citizen or resident of the US, you will never, ever, ever in your life fill out a W-8 BEN. You don't need to ask me. You don't need to ask the brokerage firm. Totally ignore this. Right on the instructions, it says, if you are a US citizen or other US person, you file a W-9. What happens is, if you send in, so here's the W-9. Anytime the company, bank, brokerage firm, or even a Mexican bank asks you for a W-8 BEN, you don't fill it out. You send them a W-9. This is the form that citizens and residents of the US will fill out. It's as simple as your name, your phone, your address, an individual, the date, and sign your name. You can get it online, just Google it, W-9. Next. So what happens, and as you know, if you're a citizen or resident each year, if you have a pension or if you have a 401k withdrawal, you're going to get a 1099 from the brokerage. You've probably all seen those in order to file your tax return. However, if you send that W-8 BEN back, instead of the 1099, they're going to report your income as if it were income from a foreigner. So it gets reported on a 1042-S. If you come to me and say, oh, you know, I have my Social Security, I have my 1099s, and they sent me a 1042-S, guess what? Your tax return is going to have to go on paper because you can't combine 1042 income with 1099 income. So the bottom line, you're a citizen or a resident of the US, always fill out a W-9, even when they ask you for a W-8 BEN. Finally, for Social Security benefits, we have a lot of people that come in with problems with Social Security. In Mexico, we have 3 federal benefit units. They're located in Mexico City in the embassy, in the consulate in Guadalajara, and in the consulate in Ciudad Juarez. You'll see on the map that is on the presentation that the federal benefits unit depends on the state in Mexico that you live. So of course, us that live in Jalisco, we're served by Guadalajara. And you look at that map later to determine if you live in another state, to determine which of the 3 units would be able to help you in case you need help. So the federal benefits unit can handle almost any issue regarding Social Security that you have. However, in one of their rules is, and this is a rule from the government, if you're going to use them, you then have to either have a Mexican address as your Social Security address, or you must consent to change your address to a Mexican address. This link that you're going to find on the presentation is a form. Basically, you go to this link and it gives you a web form that you fill out, and this then transmits to the consulate so that they can read what you've written, they can get back with you. There's no direct contact line with them. Make sure that when you fill out this form, you put in the last 4 digits of your social security number, that you put in your email address, and that you put in 1 or more good telephone numbers. If you have a home line that you don't answer, don't put it on the form. They're going to be calling you and not getting in touch with you. They will close out your case. If you have more than 1 telephone number, say you have a spouse that has a cell phone, in the notes section, feel free to put his or her contact information so that they have someone else to call in case they can't get through to your telephone. They will respond in approximately 2 to 3 weeks when you send this form to them. We had a person that come in last week with an urgent issue. I was amazed. They responded in less than 2 hours. But I mean, it was an urgent issue. It was a matter of life and death. Next. When you have a foreign address on your social security, you're required to fill out and return Form 7162. This is a simple form that asks you if your citizenship or your marital status has changed. You will receive this form early in the year, approximately every 2 years. If this form is not returned to Social Security, they will suspend your benefits until you get the form to them. The form can be sent either to the Baltimore address that is on the form, or it can be sent to the federal benefits unit that handles the state where you reside. So that would be the Guadalajara consulate for those of us in Ajijic. They tell me that they're faster processing them at the consulate than they are in Baltimore. They cannot be hand delivered, they have to be sent. So you would send those DHL or some package service that would make sure that you get that form there. And I really suggest you put on your calendar, once you get one of those forms, put on your calendar January, 2 years from that. If you don't get the form, go online, download it, fill it out, and send it in. The form doesn't change. They want to know if you're still alive. And this is the link to the information about the 7162, and it's also more information about the federal benefit units and Social Security. I'm going to put you on hold. Okay, so just some final tips before we close out today and take some questions, is that Medicare will require a physical U.S. address because Medicare is a partnership between the states and the federal government. They require a physical address in the U.S. However, you can use a different mailing address, even a foreign mailing address. Social Security, if you ever decide to, will deposit your funds to a Mexican bank account if you want. If you're getting your funds later in the month, once you have foreign bank account, those funds will be deposited between the 1st and the 7th of every month. And just another tip, when you're living abroad, if you ever need to pay the IRS, you can normally do that when you file your tax return. We have a way to transmit a tax return along with payment. But if you need to file the IRS, or if you get a notice that something is due, I suggest going to IRS Direct Pay at the link. You can put in your information and pay the IRS directly from your bank account. It's faster, it's more secure, and it prevents you from having to mail a check. And that concludes my presentation, and I'm going to pass it along to Ilona.
Okay.
And we will take questions at the end of Ilona's presentation today.
We need to load the presentation. I'm going to make it very fast, everyone. I'm with the Global Tax Reform Task Force for Democrats Abroad. And I just want to let you know that one of the reasons that we exist is because everybody after a session like this goes, oh my God, why do I have to still pay taxes if I don't live anymore in the United States? And that's because we're on citizen-based taxation, not on residency-based taxation. We're one of 2 countries in the entire world that forces its citizens, no matter where you live on this planet or another, to have to file a tax return. Now, the reason this is important is that we are regularly lobbying in Washington to try to get attention to this matter. And there are a few in Congress. We have a couple. Jamie Raskin is one. He was actually, he lived abroad himself, who are advocates for us. But the principal problem we have is most of the people in Washington think we're a bunch of fat cats, you know, living on a beach, and we've got our money in the Cayman Islands. So I want to get my presentation up so I can go through it very quickly. I just want to point out what we're doing at global level and also how this affects us here as retirees in Mexico. Okay, let's send the presentation. I'll continue on. I really will just basically make this available to everyone afterwards. Okay, we have done surveys. And as you can see, the real problem is most people abroad are like clueless. Why do we have to file? And what does it mean to me if I'm married and working abroad? What does it mean to me if I'm retired and I'll never go back to the US? Okay, next. Okay, so who are we? I just want to let you know that we're 9 million people who live abroad. Okay, and on this particular survey, the particular countries that have the largest number of Americans, Canada, UK, Germany, and so on, we are teachers, artists, aid workers, students, retirees, not fat cats. We don't make a lot of money, 86%. The income is low. We have a very low response from Latin America, and that's principally because most retirees think that they don't have to pay as soon as they leave the US. Now, you have a passport requirement that says you must file. So as Patrick was pointing out, they actually can catch up with you. So the best is play it safe. Do try to pay your taxes or at least file. And remember that we're here to help you, all of us, whether it's at our level or at Patrick's personal day by care. Also, quite a few of us are dual citizens, 57%, 82% married to non-US citizens or dual citizens. We have a right to live abroad. We have a right to have a life that doesn't require reporting to the United States. So we're advocating that. Now, the other is, look how many voted. 94% voted from abroad. Remember that. Go ahead, next. We want to really point out this is important because we send a delegate from Democrats abroad. We send delegates to the Democratic National Convention. Okay, so the top issues with citizen-based taxation. Complexity, and there's practically no IRS support. There used to be people in the embassy years ago, and not anymore. So how do you get through to the IRS? As Patrick pointed out, this is a huge problem. The requirement to file even when no US citizens are due. Dual compliance. If you're living and working in a country, you're also paying those taxes. Now, why report and perceived or real need for an accountant? And the US banking transparency, which is the big problem that people have noticed here, is all of a sudden they have to fill out more and more forms. Next. So what are we doing? We're advocating residency-based taxation. That's kind of pie in the sky, but we're working on it. Okay, the next is, this is getting down to specific points. We are requesting that the government change, the IRS consolidate the FBAR and FATCA. Okay, and to increase the FBAR filing threshold, which is only $10,000, to at least 50, and we also want to exclude low-risk counts, for example, Social Security. Eliminate the FATCA reporting for US citizens with overseas residency. This is really important. We really are trying to desperately drop some of these additional counts because they're confining us when there's no need to. Now, the other thing is, in March of 2023, the Social Security Fairness Act, which was proposed, it hasn't gone through yet, will repeal the windfall elimination provision that includes non-US pensions. There are many, myself included, that did not work in the United States for 40 years, you know, and so we're still paying the US on non-US pensions. This is very helpful for people who are on Social Security as well, because it keeps you from getting your Social Security if you have another income, pension income. We want to exempt the transition taxes for people who have small and medium-sized businesses, and we want to exempt accidental Americans. These are individuals who have been born abroad, never will go and live in the United States, but they want a passport and they want to be considered still Americans. Next. Okay, so what can you do to help? You can ask your representative. Currently, there is, as of September, there is proposed by 2 individuals in Congress, the Tax Simplification for Americans Abroad Act. This is really important. We don't want TurboTax and H&R Block to constantly tell you, you've got to have it filed with us, where you have to spend all this money. There are ways that you can pay or do it free online. And we are also advocating that the simplicity of the form for those with legitimate residency abroad should be able to file one page, like a 1040 easy. If you remember, your students did that when they were kids. Okay, you can also download our tax report. We can sign up for our tax mailing list and join DA Senior Caucus. This is one of our groups here that specializes in Medicare portability and is tracking Social Security to make sure we don't lose it. Okay, and donate to us. We're very helpful. We're very happy to have your money. Okay, that's it.
Okay, so this is Patrick again. We're going to close out the Zoom conference. I just want to let you know, if you have a question, because it's a little bit difficult to take question and answers from the Zoom call. Yes, if you would just send your question to info@lakesidetaxservice.com. That's info@lakesidetaxservice.com. Just identify yourself as a person who is with Democrats Abroad, and we'll be glad to answer your question at no charge. Thank you so much for attending today.
Okay, so we will collect this recording and collect the presentations and hopefully put it together and send it out to all these people that couldn't get on or had to leave. Better than last time, but still some problems, huh, Terry? You're muted.
Simple answer, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I got half a dozen emails during the thing saying I can't log on. I paid for this. I want my money back.
Okay.
Send me the